This is Kelly Dunham. I would like to welcome you all to our DHH Insights. Before we get started, I have a few items to go over. First, this webinar is being recorded and will be added to the MDE RDHH resource library in about 2 to 3 weeks. Any questions that you have during the live event can be added to the Q&A feature located in your Zoom controls. Questions will remain anonymous and will be read at the end of the event by the host if time permits. For those who registered for PD credits, we will verify your attendance via Zoom timestamp. And once your attendance is verified, our office will submit the credits as they were, and they'll be applied through the credit system in the next few weeks. We always like to start off with an accessibility check to make sure that everyone's needs are being met. We do have interpreters on the call today. If you need to see them more clearly, you can use the view option in the top right corner, then select gallery and hide non-video participants. Additionally, we ask that if you are not presenting, go ahead and turn your video off so that only the presenters are available or visible. Captioning is also available on this webinar. To turn it on, click the Show Captions button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And if you're not seeing that, it would be located under the More option. Lastly, just a reminder that you can adjust the layout of your Zoom screen with a shared screen. There should be a faint line separating the videos and the shared screen, and you can actually hover over that and adjust the size to meet whatever needs you have. If you need any technical assistance during the call today, myself and John Kirsch are both on the call, and you can send us a private message. At this time, I want to hand it over to Elizabeth Flores to greet you all and introduce herself.
This is Elizabeth Flores. Thank you so much, Kelly. My name is Elizabeth Flores. I am a program manager with Michigan Department of Education, Resource for Deaf, Hard of Hearing. And I just want to say on behalf of our whole team, welcome. Thank you for being with us today. I'm so excited that we're able to offer this session on this important topic of literacy for all students who are deaf, hard of hearing. So again, thank you for being here. We're very excited for an excellent conversation. And I will hand it back to you, Kelly.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Next, I just want to thank my colleague for being on this call today. John Kirsch is joining us today. Amanda Schneider is not able to be here today, but we are the Michigan Department of Education Resource for Deaf and Hard of Hearing team, and we all just want to welcome you to this call today. On the screen before you are the learner objectives that were shared out in advance for this presentation today. So I'm not going to take time to read them. We're just going to move right along. So it's my great honor to bring to you today Ann Castle, who is an assistant professor of literacy education at Michigan State University. She is also the PK through 3 literacy subject area leader, as well as the Lansing area internship coordinator at the Department of Teacher Education at Michigan State University. Go Green. In addition to that, she's the program lead for the cross-cultural teaching abroad program in New Zealand. Today, we have combined Ann's slides into one presentation just to make it a little more seamless. And so at this time, I just want to hand it over to Ann to tell you a little bit more about herself and take her liberty to share about the topic of literacy with us. Thanks, Ann.
Thank you, Kelly. Can you hear me okay? Okay, because I'm remote today, so just let me know if there's background noise. Thank you, Kelly, and your team at MDE. My name is Ann Castle, and yes, I'm an assistant professor of literacy education at MSU. I spent 20 years teaching reading and literacy for Grand Ledge Public Schools. And I'm actually right now working hourly as an ELL teacher at Eaton Rapids Public Schools. So I am got a foot in practice and a foot in teacher preparation. And Kelly, you can forward the slide. The question comes up, what is literacy? And according to the National Reading Panel, literacy is defined by these 5 constructs. And really, this research is not new. The National Reading Panel was published in probably 2002, so over 20 years ago. And these 5 essential, not to be confused with the Michigan Literacy Essentials, these 5 components of literacy, phonological awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. The top 3 are really foundational skills for kids. Those are skills that kids need to be able to decode print. And so speaking to, all children who are learning to read in whatever language they're learning to read, the ability to say and manipulate sounds in print, attach a letter onto those sounds is the phonics. Fluency is being able to do anything with automaticity, anything quickly without using cognitive brain space. Fluency can be in naming letters. Fluency can be in naming words by heart. Fluency can be reading a passage you've read over and over again. Or fluency can be reading something for the first time. We want to build fluent automatic reading to free up the brain to do the vocabulary and comprehension. So research says if children are focusing so much cognitive energy on trying to remember the sounds that letters make or words they should know by heart, if their brain is working so hard to remember those foundational components, then there isn't enough room left. There isn't enough cognitive space to think about what the story means, what makes sense, what do these vocabulary words mean? So these are those 5 essential components. And Kelly, I'll have you move forward. A little more on this, if you just Google Science of Reading or the National Reading Panel, you will find these 5 essential components. Like I said, they have been in practice and connected to research for over 20 years. The recent surge of talk about the science of reading, however, is that I would say over the last 20 years, teachers did a wonderful job working on vocabulary and comprehension and maybe timing reading or doing some phonics and phonemic awareness in isolation. But what's been missing is children in those early grades have been relying on other skills to figure out reading new text and weren't always putting phonics first. So with the science of reading, we're saying all K1 kids should use decoding and phonics first and foremost to solve words they don't know, to free up that cognitive space to work on vocab and comprehension. So the research on the science of reading is not new. It's just really brought to light that young new readers at K1 should really work on getting those decoding skills underway and automatic. It doesn't mean though that children should not be working on vocabulary and comprehension all day. I think one mistake that we're seeing in classrooms is with the shift to all the foundational skills, teachers are not weaving in vocabulary and comprehension. And I always tell teachers, you have kids for 7 hours a day. Over that 7 hours time, you should be able to get a good block of teaching foundational skills, phonemic awareness, phonics. You should have a good block of reading aloud to children, building background knowledge, building vocabulary, talking about different genres of stories. So all of that happens over those 7 hours a day through K1, 2, so that children are learning the foundational skills, but also having somebody else read to them to make meaning of print so that when they read it on their own, they will have been scaffolded through that process. So Kelly, I'll help you move forward. And actually, Kelly, why don't you go back one? Sorry. Kind of zooming in a little bit to these squares, I wanted to point out what was in these squares. So, and with your this particular audience, Kelly is going to have to bridge the gap to practice when we talk about things like word games, rhyming, tongue twisters, all of those things in phonemic awareness help children map on sounds to letters. And what we say about phonemic awareness is there's usually no print involved. We might say to the children, can you tell me a word that rhymes with sat? Maybe they'll say bat. Or can you change the beginning of sat to a buh? What word do you get? You get bat. So phonemic awareness is all that wordplay you see in K-1-2 classrooms. Again, often it's in isolated pieces, and we want to bring that into the reading part. Phonics is the moment you map on the letters. And one interesting thing about phonics that everybody might not know, even though there's 26 letters and less sounds because some letters make 2 sounds, there's actually 44 phonemes in English, and there's over 250 ways to make them. So when we think about all the ways to make the long A sound, like in the word day, it could be AY, but in other words, it's AI. In other words, it's a consonant E. So children not only have to learn the vowels short sounds like app or apple, but they need to know the multiple ways that vowels can say their other sound, which is the long sound or sound of their name. So what I notice happening in K-1-2 classrooms are children are learning all the ways to make oo. It could be OO, it could be EW, it could be it could be UI, like in suit. So children are getting explicit, direct, systematic instruction on all the 44 phonemes in the 200 plus ways to make them. Fluency in this green box really talks about having that cognitive load lifted, having kids be able to read with automaticity to focus on the meaning. We do a lot of timed reading with kids, and that all is just to show us, like, can children at the end of 3rd grade read 60 to 70 words a minute? If they can do that, that means they're reading at a fast enough pace that they are able to think about meaning while reading. If kids are sounding out every word, every 2 words they're in 3rd grade, their brain has just figured out the word repeated, repeated, and they've lost all track of the meaning of the story. So fluency is building that automaticity. We say that phonemic awareness, phonics, and fluency are all constrained skills. That means that once children learn them. They know the sounds, they know the phonemes and how to make them. They can do all this with automaticity. Those happen in those first few years of school. And as soon as they happen, it's as if children have arrived, they've broken the code. The vocabulary and comprehension, we say, are actually unconstrained skills. Children and adults will learn new vocabulary and make new meaning out of text your whole life. I've learned new words just last week. Reading with a child in the classroom, I came across a word. I think it was the word wiry, and I don't see that word in print. And I said, I've never seen the word wiry in print. I know wire, and I know what happens when you add Y to it. This is what it looks like in print. And so showing kids that you're learning new vocab every day, they're learning new vocabulary, and we're continuing to learn how to have deep comprehension. All right, Kelly, I just wanted to explain the boxes, but you can skip over. This whole report from the National Reading Panel from 200 years, from not 200, 20 years ago, seems like 200. This whole report is the basis of all the research. It shows exactly how many research projects were studied, how they went about collecting this information. It's a very comprehensive report that the practice was built on. I think one aha we've had with the science of reading is that if children need 2 things to be able to make meaning, because reading is making meaning. They have to have language comprehension. That's all the vocab and comprehension of stories when people read to them. And they have to have word decoding. Without oral language and decoding of words, you need to combine the 2 to make meaning in reading. If they just have oral language comprehension, that means that they can be read to and they can tell the story of the 3 little pigs, but they can't read it themselves necessarily. Vice versa, some kids know the code, but aren't thinking about the meaning. So they can decode nicely, but if the teacher said, tell me about what you just read, they might not be able to say. So language comprehension, and decoding skills have to come together. They weave together to help kids make meaning. So you can't just have decoding and you just can't have language comprehension. You have to build both together. And we have this rope called the reading rope by Scarsborough, which I didn't put in here, but you can Google that too. That reading rope shows that kids need to be taught those two strands together to become literate and to become readers. All right, Kelly, I'll have you go to the next slide. The literacy essentials are 10 amazing literacy practices that you can go down a rabbit's hole researching. And Kelly, I'm gonna have you go to the next slide, because in the next slide, we show kind of the overview. If you click on the link to get the K3 literacy essentials, you'll find in here, interestingly enough, phonics is in here. That decoding part is 5, explicit instruction in phonics. Vocabulary is in here. It's essential 7. Let me see what some of the other ones were. Fluent reading was in there, etc. So all of these essentials come together to create this big picture. Now, Kelly knows that I'm on a short timeline today. So on the next slide, I show you how to enroll in the literacy essentials. And this is a free course that you can click through, you can access it for free, and you can take part in learning about those literacy essentials and how they map on to what is literacy and what is the science of reading. Now, Kelly, I hate to say it, but I do have to go to my next obligation. So I'm going to let you pick up with the myths and key points, if that's okay.
Thank you so much, Anne, for sharing all of this information with us. And we know that this conversation is much deeper and probably could take multiple days, but
Yes.
we appreciate you giving us this little teaser of it. We do hope that these conversations are ongoing.
Yes, and invite me back. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Anne,
Okay.
appreciate it. This is Kelly. So just continuing on where Anne left off, I know that she planned to highlight some myths that are out there in the All About Words and book, which is all about increasing vocabulary in the Common Core classroom. And so she has done a nice job of outlining on this slide 5 myths that are discussed in this book. And I'm going to go ahead and advance them because we're going to talk through them all. So myth number 1 is that children are sponges, or children are word sponges. And I know that all of you have heard that too. And while neuroplasticity is something that is amazing and kids do pick things up, we know that children need multiple exposures to learn things. And this is especially true as we're trying to kind of bridge the gap here and focus on our students who are deaf and hard of hearing. Multiple exposures to kind of make up for the lack of incidental learning that may be occurring and that explicit instruction. Myth number 2 is that there is this kind of magical vocabulary explosion that just happens. And what we know based off of research is that word learning is cumulative and it happens over time with myth number 1, the multiple exposures to language that happen. There is no just magic that happens if a child doesn't have access to that exposure. Myth number 3 is that storybook reading is sufficient for oral vocabulary development. And again, just bridging the gap here with a DHH lens, storybook reading could be any form of receptive language input. So whether the story is being read aloud using listening and spoken language or being signed to a student using American Sign Language. We know that storybook reading is one way to increase vocabulary. However, it's not enough just to simply read. We need to be intentional about adding new vocabulary and teaching routines. That is myth number 3. Myth number 4, spelled out in this book, is and highlighted on page 8, is that we do it all the time. And the reality is we really need to be intentional about choosing words and teaching words. We cannot rely just on that incidental learning to happen. And I know my colleagues in this field of deaf education can relate to that, can draw connections to that, because we cannot rely on just that incidental learning to fill those gaps. Myth number 5 is just follow the vocabulary scope and sequence. When in reality, we know that we need to be looking for increased opportunities, other curriculum materials, supplemental resources, to constantly be meeting the needs of our kids where they're at, and not just what the scope and sequence outlines. The scope and sequence might be kind of the minimum of what's required, but we need that instruction to be specially designed and make sure that we're meeting individual needs of students. So the next thing that Anne was going to cover are the key principles that are spelled out also in this same book. So if you are not familiar with this book, it's the same one that had those myths. It's all about words, increasing vocabulary in the Common Core classroom. So I encourage you to consider checking out that resource if it's not something that you're familiar with. But the next couple slides are going to outline the key principles that are there. And that 3 of those are on this slide. Key principle number 1 is that children need both explicit and implicit instruction. Key principle number 2 is that we have to be intentional in our word selection. And by word selection, I mean the instruction that goes along with that and teaching words to kids. Key principle number 3 is that we want to work on building word meaning through knowledge networks. So scaffolding, making learning meaningful, because eventually we want kids who experience meaning when reading. And then the slide before you just highlights the last 2 principles there. That repeated exposure is necessary to gain vocabulary. And that we as professionals must be seeking ongoing professional development, constantly learning. And so I know that was a super fast overview of those 5 key principles. And like Anne mentioned earlier, that could be an entire day workshop on its own. But we hope today to just kind of give you some awareness and knowledge of key principles that are out there, and really have a better understanding of what the general education colleagues that we work with on a regular basis are being informed about and being given information and going to trainings on, so that hopefully we can improve collaboration to support student outcomes. So again, I just want to thank Anne, even though I know she's not here right now, for that presentation on the literacy essentials, as well as sharing some professional development opportunities with our audience that you can look into. We can all agree that the essentials are strategies that providers could be aligning their supports and services with as we work with students. And while most deaf and hard of hearing students are not true English as a second language learners, unless they natively use a different language, such as American Sign Language, and are learning English either bilingually or multilingually, We know and we can agree that some of the supplemental materials for English language art curriculums for ESL students do focus on visual supports and vocabulary supports as a foundation. Those two strategies are often beneficial for the deaf and hard of hearing students that we support. We know that the research and the science of reading is based on children who use language that is oral. And this potentially presents additional challenges when supporting literacy for students who are deaf and hard of hearing, who may or may not have auditory access to language or use a language that is spoken. Regardless of language or mode of communication, let's look at some of the essential principles of deaf education. So on the next slide, I want to draw your attention to those principles that are highlighted. Regardless of the language or approaches used, children who are deaf and hard of hearing are highly vulnerable to the Swiss cheese effect. And what I mean by that is holes or gaps that arise when the message expressed is incomplete or parts of the message are not received due to visual or auditory interruptions. Young children do not have the language foundation to fill in what they did not receive, leading to both receptive and expressive language deficits, and subsequently literacy gaps. These potential challenges do not directly correspond with hearing status or level. Rather, they're tied to a lack of access to language, communication, information, etc. Let's look at some of the essential principles for effective education from Optimizing Outcomes, which is the Education Service Guidelines, authored by the National Association of State Directors for Special Education. That was published in 2018. If you are unfamiliar with this resource, there's a picture of the front page of it there. And if you Google Optimizing Outcomes, you can easily pull up this document, although it is quite lengthy. And so our hope and intention is to just pull out some pieces for you so that you can build your awareness of information that is accessible to you and break it down into some smaller pieces. So these essential principles that we want to highlight today. Number one, every child is unique. Children who are deaf and hard of hearing have the same diversity as their peers. The saying goes that if you've met one child who is deaf or hard of hearing, you've met one child. Despite having the same audiogram or utilizing the same hearing assistive technology or using the same mode of communication, no two students are the same. The impact of hearing status may be completely different for each student. And we know that there are many factors or layers that contribute to each student's overall need or needs. Along those lines, we know that specially designed instruction must be individualized because every student truly is unique. One size does not fit all when it comes to instruction. As providers, we must be mindful of this and make sure that we're writing every IEP uniquely and specific to each student. While there may be similar needs for a number of students on our caseloads, And we may kind of get in the habit of copy and paste, especially when it comes to things like accommodations and whatnot. The reality is each of those should be individualized to every student, and that is our due diligence to do that and in some way make that unique to each student's needs. Another principle is that early language development is critical to cognition, literacy, and academic achievement. All young children benefit from an early start to education. The first 5 years of a child's life is critical for language development, which is the foundation for which social skills are built on. So looking at some additional principles outlined in optimizing outcomes is also that educational progress must be carefully monitored and reported according to the same requirements for all students. For most students, goals and services should be minimally result in 1 year's progress in 1 year's time. Services must be based on individual needs rather than the available resources. And the last principle that I want to just draw your attention to from this is that qualified providers are critical to a child's success. And that is all the way from early intervention through post-secondary transition and beyond. Without qualified staff and appropriate services and supports, the ability of children to achieve appropriate outcomes is jeopardized. Access determines outcomes, and that is true whether it's language, learning, services, etc. So the next thing that we'd like to do is look at some of the potential barriers that we face in the field of deaf education. So one of the benefits to identifying potential barriers is that we can work with staff to find solutions. So some of the potential barriers that you may be experiencing, specifically regarding literacy and language development for students, one is different philosophies. And this could be of inclusive practices in general. It could also be in language or mode of communication options. There are also different philosophies that exist around special education as a place or as a service. And even amongst related service staff, there may be some resistance to collaborating. There are also different perspectives to consider, and we could start to name them off: the general education teacher, the special education teacher, different related service staff, the teacher consultant for the deaf and hard of hearing, or the classroom teacher of the deaf, interpreters, administrators, parents, and I hope we don't forget the student themselves. Among all these different perspectives, there may be different levels of understanding or awareness, perhaps about the need for visuals or supports, understanding of accommodations, communication repair strategies, collaboration, etc. Maybe one question that you've run into is, what is the teacher consultant's role in supporting the ELA needs or English language arts needs of the student? Or how does the teacher consultant or the classroom teacher of the deaf work with the other staff in the building? How do they work with the SLP to support language and communication needs? How does the school support families in their native language or the language or mode of communication that's being used in the home? These are all potential areas that could be barriers. But the benefit is by identifying them, then we can work towards solutions. Another potential barrier is the reliance on the direct service model in special education. Some teachers prefer that related services take place outside of the classroom. And I won't just say some teachers, some buildings, some districts, whatever, you could fill in the blank there. This can create another layer of a barrier by having supports and services that could be disconnected from each other. And everybody kind of working in silos or on their own different things, instead of pulling things together to support the child as a whole child first. Scheduling and time management is always a potential barrier, especially, and I'm sharing from my own experience, working as an itinerant teacher or traveling teacher. Some teacher consultants have caseloads of 25 or more students who are located across multiple grades, programs, buildings, districts, even counties. So caseloads are often reviewed, but workloads might tell a different story. And being able to manage all of that can really be a barrier that some of us experience. Staffing issues are another potential barrier. We know that deaf and hard of hearing is a critical area of shortage. On top of that, the field of education in general is facing more and more shortages. We're seeing a higher number of long-term subs, emergency endorsements, and alternative paths to teacher education. There is no in-state teacher preparation program for deaf education in Michigan, but that is one reason why we've worked to offer the DHH Consortium program as a solution to this barrier. We are constantly working to grow the pool of deaf education endorsed professionals. And there are other initiatives as well, like Optimize, OPTIMISE, which is opening the pipeline of talent to Michigan special education. And they're working to attract, prepare, and retain special education professionals from teachers to paras, also including interpreters. So there are some potential solutions out there for those barriers. The next few slides are really just intended to offer some practical solutions to collaboration and share with you what that might look like. So we know that with the barrier of different perspectives and supporting students, specifically mainstream students who might be in a classroom and having multiple teacher perspectives, that sometimes we just have to take a step back and really work on building that rapport with staff to be welcomed into classrooms and not just be someone from a higher level ISD or RESD to really work to build that partnership, that relationship, and all of those things that will help the student overall. Sometimes we have to use some time in the classroom to really learn what the learning environment looks like, to have a better understanding of what the student is experiencing and how we can then use our DHH lens to offer additional solutions. And so maybe classroom observations are something that you haven't completed for a student. And that's one potential area that you could explore as you work to build collaboration. We also know that in-services can be really helpful, whether that is with staff or students or anyone else in the building who is looking to build their awareness of how to work together to support students who are deaf and hard of hearing. Another example to highlight for you is shared lesson planning. And this is just from my own experience. to be able to have shared lesson plans with a general education teacher so that I, as the support person, have that firsthand knowledge of what's being taught in the class, what content is being covered. Also to look at targeting vocabulary, as Anne highlighted earlier in the talk, as a specific literacy essential to target that vocabulary to really identify how I'm going to work to provide some explicit instruction on vocabulary. And that might look like pre-teaching vocabulary or a variety of other things. But understanding the instructional planning and strategies that are happening in the classroom, so that I can be a support piece to that. Some other things that you could potentially dive into are curriculum resources that are available. I know that Anne mentioned she has some recent experience supporting students who are English as second language learners. And my own experience with curriculums is that those type of supports are often very vocabulary based and visual based. And so that's something that a district has access to. It might take somebody with a DHH lens to ask those questions because, like I stated earlier, deaf and hard of hearing students are traditionally not ESL students. But if those supports are already available in place at a district level, they might be supplemental materials that would help support a deaf and hard of hearing student as well. Not every student, but it might take the DHH provider to ask those questions and advocate for that. Also through assessment and data collection, a couple tools that I wanted to highlight for you as we've had conversations about language and mode of communication and different perspectives is the Michigan Communication Plan, which is located on our website. Although it is not required for IEP teams to utilize a document like that, it is something that many choose to utilize and to give them a place to document as well as guide conversations about a student's communication and what it looks like both at home and at school, receptively and expressively, and what is working, what's been tried, etc. So again, the Michigan Communication Plan is one option that you might consider. There's also the Michigan Early Childhood Planning Guide that's also on our website. And although it's specific to younger age students, it is a tool that can help both families and support that family collaboration, which was one of the literacy essentials that was highlighted. And always looking at research, professional development opportunities, and learning and growing together. And I appreciate that Anne highlighted some of those opportunities for you earlier in this talk. So as we conclude kind of the presentation portion of today's call, I'd like to leave you with this final thought that access determines outcomes. What a child has access to will impact them, period. Children who will use the language that they have access to, which also means the opposite of true, is true that they cannot use the language they don't have access to. So simply put, a person's ability to access resources, opportunities, or information significantly influences the results or outcomes they experience in life. When we look at the literacy essentials that were shared earlier, collaboration and vocabulary were two of the highlighted essentials. And as I've mentioned already, this conversation is much bigger than what we could fit into our hour-long talk today. And we do encourage you to kind of keep this conversation going and explore other ways to make literacy more accessible to your students. So at this time, I will invite you, if you have questions, to use the Q&A feature. But in the meantime, I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to my colleague, John, who's going to take just a few minutes to share about some upcoming events that we have going on. John, the floor is yours.